Okay, I think we can get started. So to kick us off, I'm going to introduce, who's then going to introduce the panel and a little bit about our lab, Dr. Amy Lerman, who's a professor of political science and public policy here at Berkeley. And so, Dr. Lerman.
Thank you. I love to get introduced so that I can introduce
It's a new series.
Sure.
Oh.
I don't know where it is.
Here it comes, sorry. It's the second one of these series. We're still learning, folks. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Kelly. Is it on? Yep. How's that? So much better. So welcome. Thank you all for coming. And thank you to our fantastic panel. We're really excited about the conversation today. As Jesse mentioned, I'm Amy Lerman. I'm the executive director of the Possibility Lab. And this is the second in our series of Conversations with Possibility, where we bring in people who do interesting things and we get a chance to ask them questions and talk. So the panel will run probably for 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for questions. You're welcome to write a question on this little card or raise your hand and ask it directly. And I am really excited for a lively conversation. So I'll turn it back over to Jesse Melgar and let him introduce himself and our fantastic panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Let's hear it for Amy Lerman. And as Amy noted, my name is Jesse Melgar. I'm a senior advisor for strategy and public affairs at the Possibility Lab. But in a previous life, I got to work with a lot of these folks wearing different hats in communications and state government. So I had the privilege of serving as Governor Newsom's communications director and press secretary during the tumultuous times that was COVID-19. So I have some really great, fun, and sometimes rough experiences with our friends to the right.
Pleasure of being tortured by
Torture,
this entire
pleasure.
panel.
But a really great experience, a good moment to be able to serve the state nonetheless. And prior to that, I had served as a Deputy Secretary of State overseeing communications for Alex Padilla while he was Secretary of State, who you now know as our United States Senator, and then for Ricardo Lara and the Latino Legislative Caucus as well. So I come to the lab over the last 3 years or so with that experience, and it's been a joy to work with many of my colleagues who are here in the audience. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd actually like to thank my colleague and at the Possibility Lab, Dr. Meredith Sadin. Where are you, Meredith? Back there. And her colleague, Dr. Mia Bird. We have Mia here as well. Hey, Mia. So they have invited their professional policy practice class of first-year MPP students who are joining us today. And their class is focused on applied policy work with partners and exploring how to communicate their findings. So I imagine they may have some questions and we'll learn a thing or two from our professional panelists here on the right. And a big thank you to our co-sponsors, the Goldman School of Public Policy. I saw Bora in the room. Hey, Bora. The Institute of Governmental Studies, the Berkeley Journalism School, and the Daily Cal. So thank you to our co-sponsors. My colleague, Kelly, where are you? You can raise your hand. So Kelly has put cards, as Amy noted, on each of your seats. If you want to write questions and pass those down towards Kelly, we'll have a section where she'll read off some of the questions from the audience once we get to that point in the program. We are truly in for a treat today. To my right are three of California's top political and policy reporters, and you have undoubtedly read or listened to much of their coverage over the years. They are integral to sharing news for California's top publications like the LA Times, Politico, and KQED. They work regularly with political and policy practitioners to not only uncover scoops and to report on breaking news, but they also hold a lot of folks in power accountable, which is a very important part of our democracy. And it really is a privilege to have them all here today. So as Amy noted, this is the second installment of our Conversations with Possibility series, where we bring folks from around state government and across the country to really talk about how they contribute to the policy discussions and work in the state of California. So without further ado, I will introduce our panelists. The first is Melanie Mason, who is a senior political reporter covering California politics at Politico. She's a former political correspondent for the LA Times, and she first began working for the Times in 2011 in Washington, D.C. She covered money and politics at the time. Since then, she's moved to the Sacramento Bureau, where she wrote about state government, politics, and the 2018 governor's race, and did award-winning coverage of sexual harassment in California politics. She has also covered 3 presidential races and is originally from LA. She's a graduate of Georgetown University and the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. Welcome, Melanie. Next, we have Marisa Lagos, who is a correspondent for KQED California Politics and Government Desk and co-hosts a weekly show and podcast, Political Breakdown. At KQED, Lagos conducts reporting analysis and investigations into state, local, and national politics for radio, TV, and online. Previously, she worked for 9 years at the San Francisco Chronicle, covering San Francisco City Hall and state politics, and at the San Francisco Examiner and LA Times. Lots of LA Times alum or current employees. She's won several awards for her work investigating the 2017 wildfires and her ongoing coverage of criminal justice issues in California. She's a graduate of UC Santa Barbara. Marisa Lagos, thank you for joining us. And next we have Laurel Rosenhall, who is the Sacramento Bureau Chief overseeing the LA Times coverage of the California Capitol, state government, and state politics. She joined the company in 2021, spent a year as a member of the editorial board, writing about California politics, policy, and power. Before joining the Times, Rosenhall covered state politics for Cal Matters, as well as the Sacramento Bee. A lifelong Californian, she grew up in San Francisco and also graduated from the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. Welcome, Laurel. And that's the most talking I will do today. So let's begin by asking each of you in a few minutes to just talk about a bit about yourselves and what motivated you to pursue a career in journalism. So happy to start with you, Melanie.
Sure. Thank you guys so much for being here today. This is a really fun event. I get to sit up here with two of my good friends and colleagues and competitors and talk shop. So this is very cool. Thank you for inviting us. I'm really glad to be here. And it also feels really nice because Berkeley, and in particular the journalism school, was sort of so instrumental to me having this career. I sort of went to the J school not entirely sure if journalism was the path for me. I never worked on my school paper in high school. I never did that in college. I graduated and realized I didn't want to go to law school and then didn't know what I was going to do. And so that first semester at Berkeley's journalism school was kind of this revelatory moment where it was like, oh no, this is right. This is what I love to do. This is, if I can do this for the rest of my life, I will be incredibly lucky. And that is how I felt. I think that in terms of what kind of motivates me, there's the sort of high-minded part of it, which is holding people to account, telling people about the society, the government, the culture that they're living in, telling stories, either those that are not told enough or the ones that are told kind of in cliched ways, finding the right angle. And then there's the kind of less high-minded, but I think also just important, which is that I'm totally nosy. And I really want to know what's going on, and I want to know things that people don't want me to know. And I think that those sort of dual impulses of both kind of wanting to have this righteous impulse, but also just kind of like wanting to know the hot gossip has been sort of the two driving factors. And I think that as I've been working on my stories, I've really been trying to think of, you know, not just trying to find kind of the information for information's sake, but taking that fun impulse of like ferreting out the information that's not really known, and then how do you apply it to the more sort of righteous, you know, what good does this information do? How does this empower our readers? How does this empower other policymakers into making the right decision? And so that's been the sort of two impulses that I've been trying to balance, sometimes more successfully than not, for the last 12, 13 years that I've been a journalist. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Melanie. Marisa.
So thank you also for having me here. I agree with Melanie. I basically like to tell people it's like I gossip and then run my mouth for a living. It's fun. But also we get to learn new stuff every day. And I will say the policy aspect of my job and being able to sort of break stuff down and get into the weeds and explain it to people, honestly, in a profession where like not everybody is that interested in the policy, can be really fulfilling. I've done a lot of work on criminal justice, and like this is a moment where I think there's a lot of people saying a lot of things that are not always backed up in data and facts. And so like, you know, making those calls has become really a big part of the way I approach political journalism. And I think, you know, being at a place like KQED where I have multiple ways to tell it is really exciting. You can have the conversation where you're interviewing folks and kind of having those in the moment discussions where you all can hear them, but then also getting to spend the time to do deeper reporting that both, you know, ends up as digital pieces on the web or radio pieces is great. In terms of my beginnings, as Jesse said, I went to UC Santa Barbara. Unlike Melanie, I like always worked at the school newspaper. I went in on my first day, you know, the first training available, which was on my 18th birthday, which is also where I met my husband. We have 2 children, be careful. He's a journalist, be real careful. But, you know, for me, I just loved writing. I loved telling stories. I quickly realized that poetry was probably not going to pay my bills. I am not that good of a writer. And so it became a kind of practical way to do that. And then through that, I found that like, I actually really loved the other side of it, which is the research and the interviewing and being out there. And then I actually had kind of two really horrible things happen in my life. One was a high school friend getting murdered. One was then covering a really intense murder trial in Santa Barbara. And I think in both cases, what I took from that and the way some media treated either me as, you know, a victim's friend or us as student journalists was really disrespectful and like not the way I think responsible journalism happens. And so I would say out of those experiences, I really came to understand that like sometimes our role is to just be a witness for things. We talk about the first draft of history, but before you even get there, you have to be a witness. And I think that sometimes like that bearing witness to people's pain or joy or whatever that is as powerful as kind of what we end up telling the public. So those are that's my high-minded approach.
Thank you.
And then yeah, I get to like, you know, yell at the governor and ask him questions and
It's been a very liberating
all
3 years
those
for me.
things. Yeah.
Thank you, Marisa. Laurel.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. Like Melanie, I have always been very nosy. I was a child who was sort of always being told to mind my own business. And so when I look back, I think I gravitated toward a career that would sort of reward me for a personality flaw, basically. And so that was what led me toward journalism. I just loved the idea of being able to do something different every day. And I did not set out to focus on politics, but after I graduated from Berkeley, the first job I got was at the Sacramento Bee. I covered local news there. I ended up moving into the more state politics realm, covering the state capitol. And I guess I have found my niche. I've been there for many years now. And the thing that kind of keeps me going is that when you cover the state capitol, you can really cover anything under the sun. Like literally every issue in our society comes through that building. So you like raw politics and, you know, sort of the competition of elections and people climbing for higher office, like that's happening right there. You want to go deep on policy and geek out on, you know, climate change and sort of what governments can do to address that issue, like that's happening there. Criminal justice, you know, like everything. And then plus the ability to do the frankly most important function that we can do as journalists of like holding the government to account, discovering new information that wouldn't otherwise be known if journalists weren't doing their jobs. Like you can do that there too. And there is competition. We have great journalists covering California, but we don't have as much coverage of the state capitol as we should, given the size of our state and the size of our population and the power that California has to influence policy and politics across the country. So I've found a niche that I like, and I think, yes, it began as being the little girl who was always being told to kind of go somewhere else. Now I get politicians telling me to go somewhere else.
They're very persistent and do their jobs well.
I can, parts of our job is that like we get to just like knock on someone's door or call them up and demand they answer. Like I often am like, I wouldn't talk to me. Like what is wrong with these people? But you'd be amazed at how many people you're just like, hey, can I pick your brain about, you know, whatever? And it's like, yeah, sure. It's great.
Well, so speaking of that, so once you knock on their doors and once they actually talk to you, my first question is actually for Melanie. So this is about just breaking down the different terms that are used when you're engaging with a reporter. So we've all heard off the record, we've all heard background, deep background, and there's other versions that have been made up over the years that I've heard. But was wondering if you can talk a bit about what are the rules for using these terms and what are the terms that we've not identified so far, like that you are using more and more.
And which shouldn't we?
And what shouldn't, yeah,
And
what are the
should
made up
we?
ones
Yes,
that aren't
allow me to start that riff. Well, here's the first thing is that the interesting thing about being a journalist is that unlike, say, being a doctor or other sort of licensed professions, a lawyer, for example, there are actually we don't have a license to be journalists. We are employed as journalists, which is great, but really anybody can get up and start asking questions. And what that means is that while there are a pretty well-established set of best practices, there is, every journalist that you talk to may have a slightly different understanding of these certain definitions. So the first thing I would say, whenever you're talking to a journalist, whether it is talking for a one-off story or trying to build a relationship about, maybe they're reporting on a beat, which is something you specialize in, is first thing that you should ask is, all right, what are the terms of this conversation? It's certainly something that I try to do when I'm getting to news sources is sort of lay out your definitions. So off the record. Off the record means it's in the vault. You are telling me information sort of for my consumption only. I'm not going to go and call Marisa, my next source, and say, I heard from someone that blah, 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 blah. Like, it is something really for my own edification, but it can't manifest itself in the stories that I'm reading. And so because of that, if you tell me something that is off the record, but that you want that to be reflected in my story, don't say it's off the record. There is another category that we can put this in. And this is the wonderfully nebulous term on background. Everybody has a different definition of what on background is. Also, deep background is a thing that started because of John Heilman and Mark Halperin in, what was that book? I can't even remember the book. The one about Sarah Palin. That now it's a term of art. If you ever talk to somebody in DC, they'll be like, can we be on deep background? And I'm like, sure, if you'd like. Just makes it sound a little bit more like, I don't know, sexy, but it really doesn't mean anything different. Background sort of means that this is information that I can use in reporting, whether that is to somehow have that manifest in my story or to build upon in the reporting, but that it is not going to have your name attached to it. And so there are going to be ways that you're going to negotiate what that looks like. Is this something where there's sort of not for attribution at all? Can I sort of largely say that this is something that is attributed to somebody that holds a certain position? Sometimes when you see the anonymous sources, which is something that we try to really, really limit our use of for understandable reasons, but sometimes it's a necessity, that would be a background quote. And then the gold standard, the thing we would love for you to be on all the time if you possibly can, is on the record. On the record's the cleanest, it's the easiest. You're gonna have your name attached to it, you're gonna have your position attached to it. It's going to be a thing that is going to convey to our readers that you are providing information that is trustworthy because you know what you're talking about. And so I think that what we like to do whenever possible is have something on the record. I understand that that's not possible at all times, that sometimes information, you can't have your name attached to something. Maybe it's something that's politically delicate, but sort of making sure that you constantly are understanding what these definitions are based on the journalists that you're talking to, because there's not a rule book that we're all consulting, I think is the best way to avoid any sort of pit in your stomach moments of like, oh God, I thought that I was off the record, but this person's saying that this is attributed to a student at Goldman Public Policy School, and I didn't want that to happen. Have that conversation at the outset. And I'm sure you guys have other
any other thoughts on?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the assumption that most mainstream journalists live by is that if you're talking to me and you don't say otherwise, we are on the record. There's some caveats to that. We all know reporting on the Capitol that most staff members don't give on the record quotes because they want the principal, the legislator they work for, the governor, whoever it is, to be out front and taking either responsibility or credit, usually credit. So I think that over time, if if we have a relationship and I'm constantly calling you about a policy issue, that we might come to an understanding. So every time we pick up the phone, you may not have to say that. Maybe the understanding is we're always on background unless you want to go on the record. But that is a special dispensation that we have agreed to, sort of thing. So I do think the easier assumption is if I'm talking to a journalist, that this is something that could show up, in print. Something else Melanie said, but you want to jump on?
Oh, I agree with everything they said. The only thing I would add is just that all of these things are an agreement. So it can't just be a one-sided announcement of this is off the record. Psh, it's it's best to have an agreement. Do you mind if I go off the record with you? And then talk about what that means. And very often when people say off the record, what they really do mean is on background. Very often what they mean is I want you to know this information. I want you to pursue this information. I just don't want my name attached to it. And so, and so that's helpful to talk that out and come to an agreement.
And to that point, a great way to immediately sort of irk a journalist is not framing it as a question. If you wanted to talk about something on the record or sorry, off record or on background, a better way to approach it is, can we go off the record for a second, as opposed to this is off the record. It's not, this is a two-sided agreement. Just adding that question mark at the end will go a long way to sort of helping build this relationship with the journalist, because nothing gets our backs up more than feeling like a source is setting the terms of a conversation that we haven't agreed to. Just as you wouldn't like it if we sort of said like, this is X without there being an agreement. Add that question mark, it'll go a long way.
On the other side of that, like, our currency is our reputation. So if we go around burning people, it's gonna get out, right? Like the people in whatever beat we cover, or whatever community we're covering will know, like, oh, hey, you can't trust Marisa because I said that was on background and then she went and threw me under the bus or whatever. So I know that people are like naturally skeptical of journalists, but it is generally in our best interest, as well as yours, to sort of create and come to agreements that then we stick with, because nobody's going to talk to me if they feel like I'm burning people left and right.
Right, and there's different levels of sensitivity for when you're a practitioner, right? Like if you want the story to get out, you might give an exclusive to someone that you trust, or that their beat aligns with a certain piece. So really having this like understanding of the rules of engagement for reporters, I think, is really valuable, particularly for those of you who want to go into policy roles, because what ends up happening is the comms folks will become the buffers for the policy experts, and then the policy will set the terms and then hand it off to a colleague who's usually the legal or policy person, who then will give the expert on background piece of information that we're trying to relay to the public. So very insightful. It's super helpful. Did you want to?
I guess I would just add, though, I gotta say, there has been a very frustrating trend in government toward less and less on the record information, particularly in state government in the last few years. And it's gotten to the point of insanity where you have, people whose jobs, taxpayer-funded jobs, are to be communicators. They're literally, their title is like public information officer, and they won't do an interview on the phone on the record. They'll only email a quote that's been, scrubbed and approved and, sanitized, and
Which is useless for broadcast.
right. And then, and even for us, it's like we want information that comes more naturally, right? Like more digestible, more conversational, and then often it'll even say like, please attribute this to the Department of blah 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 blah. And like they don't even want their name on it, and when their job is to be a spokesperson. So like that is a problem, and we in the Capitol Press Corps are pushing back against it in the ways that we can, because it's really unnecessary, and it creates less transparency, which I feel like the government should be in the favor of transparency, just like we should.
It's like grammatically incorrect too. Like departments cannot speak.
Right. So it's an interesting point, Laurel. I'm glad you raised it. Can you talk a bit about the Sacramento Press Corps? Mm-hmm. There's like the Sacramento Press Club and other kind of entities where you all talk pretty regularly. Can you shed some light on like how that works in practice?
I mean, the Sacramento Press Corps historically was large back when there were more newspapers all over California. There were, everyone had a reporter in Sacramento who covered their like region's delegation. It sounds so quaint now, but when I started in my career like 20 years ago, like the Modesto Bee had a reporter in Sacramento who covered the like legislators from Modesto, and the newspaper in Ventura County had someone in Sacramento. He was amazing. Yeah, he was really good.
Like legendary.
Yeah, and I mean, and so there was this very robust press corps. It has gotten smaller over time. It has also changed in exciting ways over time. There didn't used to be Politico. There didn't used to be Cal Matters. Like those are now new entities that are really robust part of the press corps. So we're there in Sacramento. We're covering state government. We have something called a Correspondents Association that is this like official body that negotiates with the leadership of the Senate and Assembly and the governor's office about things like press access and sort of the things that go on behind the scenes in terms of like how we function in our jobs. And then we also have the Sacramento Press Club, which is more like puts on public speaking events and some journalism awards and things like that. So
thank you. That's super helpful background. Thank you. Marisa, this next question is for you. How the public is receiving their news is evolving. I read a piece, I think a week and a half ago, that young people are consuming more and more of their news on TikTok, for example. So as someone who's kind of in a mixed media job, I know. As someone who's kind of in a mixed media job, what trends are you seeing in how folks, particularly younger folks, are consuming news, and how is that impacting, KQED?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all trying to figure out like the secret sauce here. This has been the case since I started in journalism straight out of college 20 years ago, where, I moved up to the Bay Area in the shadow of Silicon Valley. Like the Chronicle was like, ooh, there's a web, like we should have a web desk, So we've always been a little behind the 8 ball here. I mean, in a place like KQED, I definitely think we're trying to meet people where they are. So like we have a TikTok channel, we have a lot of content that goes on social that, in itself is not like the sort of meat of a lot of the reporting I do, but might be an entry point for people. As Jesse mentioned at the top, I also co-host Political Breakdown, which is now a daily podcast. And we've seen a lot of success with this in terms of just, listenership. I think people are really engaged in an election year. And that's an area too where I think we're looking at ways to just go at things like a little bit in a different approach that might be more interesting to folks who, may not be our typical NPR listener. So, for example, a few weeks ago, after Trump attacked Biden for his stutter, we had a stuttering activist on the show to kind of unpack that and talk about her work and how we should be talking about these things. So yeah, I think this is a weird moment because if you look at I can say this because none of us are in this industry, but cable news, TV news in general, I mean, the networks still reach an incredible amount of people. You can't underscore that. But the business model of TV news is not really working. It is so incredibly expensive to produce television news. And so I think that's an area to really watch in the coming years. How do they adjust, when they still have so much dominance, despite, I think, the kind of business model falling apart. And so I think we're gonna have to, be careful, but to Mel's earlier point about there not being, a bar association like there is for attorneys or a licensing board like for doctors. I mean, technically, we're doing the same work as David Pecker, who's up there from the National Enquirer, in Trump's trial this week. And so I do think that that's the hard thing as everything becomes so much more siloed is the ability to hold people to account and to say okay, you might like this person's personality, but whatever they're serving up on TikTok or Instagram isn't actually fully accurate. There's just not the same number of eyes that there are historically on mainstream media. And so I think as consumers, that's something I would be really careful about is to just that's not to say you can't do that stuff in a responsible manner, but how do you know that this person is, reliable? It takes work, as a consumer of news.
I just want to jump in because you invoked David Pecker, and I think it's really important for everyone to know if you have been following Trump's trial this week, the big thing that came out yesterday was about the payments that David Pecker was making for these stories. We do not do that. That is a National Enquirer thing.
That's a tabloid.
Yeah, that's a tabloid thing to pay for stories. Mainstream news organizations like ours do not do that. We do not have any financial relationship with the people that we cover and the stories that we write and don't write. We do not have a financial investment in that. That's a really fundamental difference.
I would just say that one of the other things, and I don't know how we solve this problem, but this is kind of the crux of the problem, is that I understand, we'll kind of maybe reflexively kind of cringe a little bit at the idea of TikTok being a main source of news, but it's a delivery mechanism, right? I mean, my attention span has shrunk because our brains are being rewired. I mean, I don't know. So I understand the appeal of watching kind of a minute and a half video where someone's just going to distill sort of what is going on. I don't think that the appetite for information or news has diminished, but you want it packaged in this way. what is the still fundamental truth, though, and I think what the fundamental tension is even people who are sort of distilling that news on TikTok, they're still drawing on sources that are what original reporting comes from. And so if you start seeing newspapers shrink, or if you start seeing public radio sort of shrink, or even, I still think of Politico as print, even though we're basically a digital-only operation, but with the same, I'm a newspaper gal through and through. If not for the reporting that we're doing, then TikTok doesn't have the content to then distill and package in more sort of digestible ways. And so I don't know how we solve that. Like that's a business school problem. I would really love for somebody to solve that. But it is also a journalism problem, and it's a public policy problem. And in fact, there have been some efforts in Sacramento to sort of try and get at this understanding that like what is powering all of this desire for information that is still like unquenchable out there is people who are going out and doing the original reporting, who are scouring, the Wall Street Journal that broke open the original story about the payments that were made. Like that was like shoe leather, good old-fashioned reporting. And then that's now been, repackaged and sliced up and transmitted in all these wonderful ways, and that's great. But if you didn't have that Wall Street Journal report, you don't have any of this. And so I think that there's, I try not to reflexively be like, ugh, people are watching TikTok. Because like I also would like somebody to tell me in a minute and a half what's necessary about the news. But if you don't have that original sort of source material, then you don't have all of the stuff that now is like reaching people and is easier for people to digest. And that's, I think, a riddle that we all have to solve.
No, those are great points, and it brings me to the next question, which I think goes towards trends and what we're seeing as far as evolution of how folks are consuming their news. So artificial intelligence.
I was just thinking about that.
Let's go there. So, our lab, we have projects working with state government departments and agencies on AI, but really curious to know, how has technology and AI affected your industries? I think the assumption is it's all bad in some way, but maybe there are good examples of how you've all been able to use AI in your work on the day-to-day basis. So I'll open this one up if anyone has any thoughts on how AI so far is impacting.
So the LA Times has something called the Quake Bot, which is basically an AI-powered service that writes about earthquakes. And since that's a very specific data-heavy occurrence, right? Like it works well for AI because the robots kind of pick up when an earthquake happens, exactly where, exactly what time, and generates a teeny little article, like a couple paragraphs long, just saying like, this earthquake happened in this location at this time. And that's about it, it's just literally just that. It's written in sentence format, but it doesn't have quotes or context or anything, but it's just kind of, and so anyway, so it's called QuakeBot. And so when there are earthquakes, you'll see those little QuakeBot articles pop up on the LA Times. I feel like that's an interesting and okay way to use AI in journalism. Those are data points that if a robot can pick it up instead of a person and just kind of do that, that doesn't bother me. And honestly, though, for the really most powerful stuff we do, I hope I'm not naive, but I am at this moment, with what I've seen with AI, I'm not worried about job security for journalists, because AI is basically regurgitating, repackaging information that's already out there. And journalists are, again, at our highest and best use, we are out there finding new information. And so right now the robots can't do that. So I feel okay for now.
Yeah, I was thinking about this when Mel was talking about TikTok. It's actually very akin. You can report a data point if you're a robot, but you can't go out and get reaction. You can't go and see somebody's house and whether something fell off the shelf. This is a really easy example, but I think a lot of what AI is doing so far, and obviously the technology is improving every day, is taking all the work we did and then spitting it back out, right? And so I think that most newsrooms, including ours, are having conversations about the ethics of this and when it's okay to use something like ChatGPT, which incidentally was created literally across the street from KQED, kind of funny. But And I think that there's like, and I think there's gonna be applications in educational settings and things like that where you can use it super ethically. And maybe it's to, help you get started on something when you're having like that moment of like a page that's empty and you just can't get the first sentence down. Or to help us kind of like start on a research path. I personally haven't used a ton of it. I know like my husband has played around a little with ChatGPT. I know some people in government who have used it for like the first drafts of, a letter you're sending to taxpayers or something, just to like, again, like kind of get the juices flowing. But I think as it changes, we're gonna have to be careful. And I think the biggest sort of threat, to Laurel's point, is going to be, I don't want to have low-hanging fruit, but it's like, it's a lot of the stuff that we've already see, honestly, hedge funds decimate in journalism. Like, it's these like smaller, kind of like the way we've seen, just the hemorrhaging of like small local news jobs. Like, that's what worries me, is that big companies will try to use this like in place of some of this stuff. And I think that like, there's really no way you can sort of change out how important the humanity is. I mean, we joked at the beginning about gossiping, but like when I covered San Francisco City Hall, literally a third to half of my job was just like going around to the different supervisors' offices, coming in and being like, hey, Jesse, what's up? What are you working on? And Jesse inevitably be like, nothing that interesting. And I'd be like, oh, how's your husband? How's your kids? Whatever it is. And then suddenly it's like, oh, I'm actually writing this piece of legislation. And you're like, oh, that would be a great story. Tell me when it's ready. And like those sorts of human interactions, you can watch every city council meeting online, but you're not going to understand the context if you're not having that. And so far that I know of, AI can't do any of it.
The one thing I would add is that there's two other ways where I think we're at least trying to think about AI, or at least and how it affects our day-to-day jobs. The first is, which has been discussed as ad nauseum, and I'm sure that you all think about this a lot, but just the idea of disinformation or misinformation, particularly in political journalism context, right? It just underscores what we always knew, which was trust but verify. But there is now such higher possibility for shenanigans, and shenanigans I think maybe puts a cutesy gloss on it, but sometimes really malevolent actors, right? And so I think that particularly as we're moving into new technologies, and as I am coming to terms with now, I'm not like the young upstart in the newsroom that's like digitally native, but now I'm like one of the older people that is clunky at sort of trying to understand this stuff, finding it really incumbent upon myself and my peers to just really be checking yourself when you're seeing things that might look too good to be true or too salacious to be true. Is there now this added possibility that there's been some sort of manipulation that's gone on? Those are things that we have had to think about. I mean, faked documents. I mean, ask Dan Rather about this during the George W. Bush election of 2004? Was that the year? I mean, there's a long history of this stuff, but there's just, because the dissemination can go so wide and because the stuff can be generated so quickly, I think that that's something that we need to be thinking about. And then another way that we're thinking about this, and you both sort of alluded to this, but this is a labor issue. Politico is a unionized shop. I believe all three of our newsrooms are unionized shops. And I think that as we're trying to think about, we want there to be technological innovation, and I don't want to get out over my skis because I'm not like an officer in the guild or anything, but just knowing that we are constantly thinking about, we don't want to delay any sort of technological progress in the newsroom, but we don't want technology to be used as an excuse to replace workers. And that's conversation that's happening with truckers, that's happening with grocery store clerks, and it's happening with journalists. I mean, I think that the AI possibilities for labor relations, I think is vast, and something that we don't know what's out there, but we want to make sure that we are not going to sort of be surprised when it comes to us, which quite frankly, a lot of the other sort of digital revolutions that's happened in media took us by surprise, and I think really hurt our industry. So we're trying not to replicate those mistakes.
Just think of the ethical implications of so back in the day, you used to have like all these police reporters who would just like go get the blotter from the police station and write up a thing. Oh, somebody was arrested, somebody was arrested. I think nowadays, like a lot of us are like, wait a second, that is a one-sided story. Like that is the police officer's account of something, which is fine, but like, in general, I think a lot of places have moved away from that type of reporting. Like you could see an AI bot doing that, but that's like literally just sort of, taking existing infrastructures and like strengthening a power structure that maybe needs to be questioned. And so I just think like those are the types of things that it could seem like, oh, that's an easy thing. Nobody wants to do that job. But like, what are the ethical implications of that beyond whether it's accurate? Like, who gets to be in power and who gets to decide what is right and what is like fact?
And I wonder, even from like an intellectual property conversation, like all of the reporting you all do is online and ChatGPT, not just single.
That.
Yeah.
And that is informing some of maybe the drafts, and I don't want to single out any one company, but that's the one that everyone knows. Have those conversations been had internally about like how do we protect our intellectual property and our original content from being used?
Come on, that's above our head, Jessica.
It's a policy conversation.
It's so
so-
important. It's so
we are but
important.
scrubs in these newsrooms.
I mean,
hopefully somebody's having that.
Yeah,
conversation.
well, no, Politico, you guys do have a deal to, I think Politico has,
I mean,
I
the New
think-
York Times is suing.
New York Times is
opening,
suing.
yeah.
I thought Politico already had a deal with ChatGPT to get paid for its all the information that it's scraping. But no, it's a hugely important and sort of outrageous thing that we even have to confront this when you think, oh my God, for decades we've been putting intellectual property onto the internet, and now it's just
And
getting
not being able to get paid for it.
Right, and now it's just getting scooped up and making other people rich, and our companies are going broke and laying people off. Like, it's very outrageous when you get down to it. So we definitely, as an industry, have to. New York Times has sued, and I hope that we will have an industry-wide solution so that the wealth transfer is shared with the creators of the intellectual property.
Yeah, and I think we're early in these conversations, of course, but I think it's an important one to have. Next question, and then I think we're maybe opening it up to audience questions in a bit. And Laurel, I think this is more for you, but welcome others as well. So the next topic is one that is widely read, but I think often misunderstood, and that's the opinion pages in a newspaper or in an outlet. How many of you have ever submitted an op-ed? A few of you? How about a letter to the editor? Right, you kind of submit it and then it goes into the darkness of the editorial board and you either hear back or you don't. So I wonder, Laurel, could you shed some light as a former ed board member of the LA Times on how this works and what aspiring practitioners should know?
So I've spent most of my career on the news side of journalism, but I did spend a year on the opinion side, and I was on the editorial board. And yeah, it's, I think a lot of our structures are, they're based on the traditions of a printed newspaper. And I think it's been challenging to kind of teach a new generation of consumers sort of the traditions, people who are consuming information online. But yeah, the idea of an op-ed, I mean, that phrase comes from, it was opposite the editorials, because it was literally on the printed pages. You'd have the editorials on this side and you'd have the other opinions that were opposite the editorials on this side, and those were called op-eds. And so traditionally, an op-ed means that it's written not by the newspaper, it's an outside opinion that comes in. An editorial is sort of the official opinion of the publication. It's a group opinion. So when I was on the editorial board, our process would be that we would, each writer on the editorial board would come to a meeting and pitch an idea, pitch an idea with an angle, I think we should support this because blah, 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 or I think we should oppose this because blah, blah, blah. But then there would be a conversation and we would come to some kind of group opinion. There were a few occasions where we did vote, and it was kind of the majority won, but usually we came to a group opinion, and if people had some dissenting feelings, we would find a way to kind of work those into the editorial so that it would kind of reflect a little flavor of the conversation. But yeah, we have so many different forms of opinion articles that we now publish on our websites, and so I think it's hard for a lot of people to identify the difference. And so ideally we label an article as opinion and then a headline or something, but we have a lot of different jargon that we use, and that can be confusing. So editorial is one thing, commentary, op-ed, column, opinion. All of those are ways of indicating to the reader that this is not a straight news story, this is someone's take. But again, because news travels differently on the internet and people aren't seeing things packaged, again, on a page with the top that says opinion section or editorial page, it can be harder for people to understand the differences. But yes, if you like, all publications have a sort of how to submit your opinion kind of info page, and that really is the best way to start. And then the other thing is most publications also have a directory of actual humans who work in every single section. So I would say use a combination of those two things, like follow the method that they're asking you to follow for submitting an op-ed or a letter to the editor, but then look at the directory of who are the people who work in the opinion section, and then you can always follow up with them specifically as individuals.
Yeah, maybe a question for the two of you. So I can't tell you how many times I've worked with legislators, not necessarily my bosses, but just in the Capitol, where when the Sacramento Bee or LA Times or anyone writes an editorial, they assume that's the opinion of every reporter who works in that publication, and then they'll try and like not talk to that publication or those reporters because they're like, well, they wrote this about that, so why they're already convinced.
Okay, but
thoughts
be
on that?
honest.
Yeah.
Do they assume that, or do they use that
Some
as
do.
a reason to be mad?
No, 100% I can say some do.
Okay,
who
well,
maybe
that
don't
makes
know
me
better.
very worried about news literacy of the people we elect to represent us, which is a good thing. But I would have a bunch of sparring matches with people in the Capitol where they, I'd go up for an interview, they'd be like, well, did you see what you guys wrote? And I was like, let's see, who are the you guys in this tradition? Oh, it's the editorial board. And I would say, you know better than that. You know that there's a firewall. You know that, is my byline on it? No. So it's interesting to me that you know better than I do what is in their, deepest
I think
hearts.
a lot of like freshman legislators or folks who just are newer to like the Capitol, in my experience, they actually do assume that that's the opinion of,
And in some ways, I guess that makes them not all that different from a lot of the, the average reader. And to Laurel's point, because things have become disaggregated, one of the things that's been really difficult, and I think social media has made it especially tough, because we'll see things like, the LA Times, so Politico doesn't have an op-ed section in an editorial board, which has really been just a blessing for me as somebody who doesn't have to deal with that. But I was at the LA Times for 12 years. I feel like I've sort of still see myself as an LA Times person. And so the LA Times' main Twitter account will tweet out news stories and opinion stories. And sometimes just in the headline, in the tweet or the post or the X or whatever we're calling it these days, it doesn't say column.
Well, especially now with the links being on.
Exactly. And that's tough. I mean, there was I remember times during the recall, for example, where there were certain pretty provocative, well-argued columns, but maybe with a provocative headline that really wanted people to click, that it just says Los Angeles Times X. And for those of us who were out covering the campaign, we would hear from that on Voters on the Trail. Well, the LA Times thinks blah, blah, blah. And that was a really, really difficult thing for us in the field to deal with. And I don't, other than just sort of maybe like one by one trying to sort of explain to people the difference that between, and I think part of the problem is that there are so many outlets now that don't have a firewall, right? I mean, they're partisan, they are proudly partisan. It's not like they're trying to hide the ball, but you're not seeing them distinguish between this is news coverage and then this is sort of commentary or opinion, what have you. And so I think that it overall just makes things very messy for then, whether it's readers or viewers or listeners or legislators, to sort of, they don't have it understanding the kind of delineation between the two. It makes our jobs really difficult.
But also, I think what the part we didn't say, either of us, is that there is this real barrier. And when I was on the editorial board and Melanie was on the news side, she didn't know what editorials I was working on. She didn't know what I was working on until it was published. And right?
That's correct. I mean, editorials we are just as surprised when they come out as the person who it's about, which I think is good. I think it preserves that sort of integrity. I think another thing that's difficult is that there are also columnists that work on the news side. I mean,
Yeah,
some
I know,
very
that's even more
cherished
confusing.
colleagues of mine who do exactly the same kind of reporting that we do, but then write it in a voice and sort of so that you know where their opinion is. And I think that there's tremendous value in what they do. But I think trying to explain to readers what's different from like a George Skelton column and a Laurel Rosenhall story can
Right.
be really tough because you are doing the same things, but George is saying his opinion.
Yeah,
And
I
Laurel
think
is not.
that's easier. I think people kind of understand that, especially in this era of like personality-driven media. I would say, cover your ears, Laurel. I think we should kill editorial boards for newspapers. And I say that not because, like, or maybe like move it, because to Laurel's point, it doesn't look the same anymore. Like most people aren't reading it and it's really confusing. And I think it does often undercut our credibility in multiple ways. And I say that despite the fact that I actually think like the work they're doing is often really good. Like I love the idea that you're in there with a group of people and like hashing it out. I think like in this past March election, like some of the best actual takes on the really confusing ballot measures in San Francisco were from the editorial board. But as somebody who worked at the Chronicle for a decade and like literally had to like rebuild our reputation at City Hall in part because of, well, not just the board, but columnists as well. Yeah, it's hard, and I think it's harder in this moment when we have so much distrust, and it just creates confusion. And I think, if not kill it, like we need to like really reshuffle it and do it in a different way.
Thank you all for sharing your perspectives there. Kelly, do we have any?
Did I come on?
There we
Okay,
go.
good. Yeah, we have lots of questions. I think just to start us off with, not quite the same as the editorial board stuff you've been discussing, but could you talk a little bit about, from the practitioner side, about the style guides that you use, especially when it comes to language evolving, of what you're allowed to use and not allowed to use, which I think can be a little bit different than how the society is progressing a little bit, just to give sort of an insight into that for folks that aren't as familiar.
We're always having conversations.
I mean, I think one of the things, to your point, is style guide. I mean, there are internal kind of in-house publications and debates that happen, and then style guides are changed. And I can give a really specific example about an interaction that you and I had when you were in one of your past roles, where I believe it was when you were working for then State Senator Ricardo Lara, and there was a bill having to do something with maybe it was a healthcare. It might have been health for all, so providing Medi-Cal for people who are in the country illegally. And I use that phrasing purposefully because when I wrote my story, I said this gives healthcare to, I believe it was people under 27, right, who are in the country illegally. That was the LA Times style. That is the LA Times style. And that was something that had changed. For a while, it was illegal immigrants. And then based on a conversation within the sort of the copy editors, there's specific people who have those conversations, and as society evolves and as sort of our understanding about sort of the significance of language changes, there is a recognition that describing a person as illegal is just not accurate. Human beings aren't illegal. It's be as descriptive as you possibly can in the language. What is illegal? What is breaking the law? It is the act of being of not doing sort of the legal necessities to either have a green card, be in the country legally. So it's like clunky, right? Like none of us like writing person in the country illegally. And Jesse, you came up and you said you used the I word. And I said, yeah, that's what our style guide says. And you said, well, why don't you use undocumented? And we don't use undocumented because undocumented is a phrase that comes out of the advocacy space. And just as we don't use the phrases pro-life or pro-choice, which are a lot of times what advocates use to describe their position, we use language that accurately and specifically sort of describes what is going on. And undocumented is, quite frankly, like kind of hard for people to grasp if you don't really understand the context of what's coming from. We were playing different roles. Sure. You were playing from a role as somebody who was advocating for a bill, working with a lot of immigrants' rights groups. Right. Undocumented was kind of the term of art that was used there. We had our own, and we had a very polite conversation. It wasn't hostile.
She's here today, which
shows
it.
But it was reflective of the fact that within the newspaper, we had a style guide that was very thoughtfully considered about what language should we be using to describe certain things. And they are different than necessarily what advocates want. A lot of times that means that newspapers are maybe like a step or two behind where society sort of ends up going. And I think that's because as sort of societal changes happen, advocates are often the ones that are on the front lines. And we sort of watch to see how things evolve, what sort of settles into becoming sort of the most accurate terms to reflect the current state of things. We're not going to change things immediately because I think we want to be able to accurately sort of take the temperature and see how certain language develops and is used more widespread. And so I think understanding the different roles that we play, that we are not in an advocacy space, that we are in a descriptive space, and that those conversations are constantly going on within newsrooms and having some really serious conversations.
And we're often disagreeing with each other.
Right.
I mean, we've had this conversation, like think about the way language has changed in recent years, like Latinx. That is still a controversial term for a lot of people in the Latina community, right? And so like, when I was growing up, my Mexican grandfather said Hispanic all the time. That's like more of a generational term now. It's still used like in the census. And so, we had really extensive conversations in our newsroom over the last few years during the abortion debate over inclusivity. And do you say people who get pregnant? Do you say women? Is being inclusive somehow actually, political too? Because let's be clear, it's mostly women's reproductive organs that are like, there's a lot that goes into it. And I think like the good news is we're having actual debates over it. It's not usually just like coming down from on high. I will mention like the default is usually AP style. If you don't have.
What is AP style?
So the Associated Press puts out an entire style guide. They update it, I think, every year. And this is sort of like if you work someplace and it's not in the LA Times or Politico or KQED style guide, you would default to the AP style guide. And that's kind of like how things work. But often we disagree with the AP style guide. And so we will add things on that are maybe beyond or maybe are a little bit newer. I think AP takes a little longer to catch up because like they are kind of trying to be the arbiter for everyone. Also, and it's different in California than it might be in Kentucky, like the way people are speaking.
But practically, it also means if you're going to be writing, if you're working in a public policy space and you anticipate you're going to be writing op-eds, submitting letters to the editor, have an AP style guide. Like, that's a good way to submit something that will most likely align with then whatever publication you're trying to land. And then they can sort of make tweaks that are specific to their publication. But knowing the AP style guide is not just a journalist thing. It really is anybody who's working in any sort of public writing.
Yeah.
Great. A couple questions about covering public policy. How do you go about breaking down really complex issues so that readers can connect with them if it's a policy issue? And or one way I know that they're saying to do that is to sort of tell the stories of real people that are impacted. So if you go that route, how do you find those sources and connect that story that way for the panel?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a journalist, and this gets back to some of the practical stuff, like, so say you have a policy issue you're working on and you really want to connect with one of us. Like, honestly, the best thing to start with is like, hey, do you want to grab coffee? Like, let's just go have a background conversation, for example, and talk about this. And let me tell you a little bit about it. I mean, for me, when I'm digging into this stuff, I'm trying to talk to as many people as I can before I'm actually even like necessarily doing the reporting itself, just to like understand what is at stake here. What are people on different sides of this issue saying? What's the data and sort of research they're relying on? And then I think, right, so then we often want to use a sort of narrative to get into that story. But like the truth is, I should hopefully as a journalist, like almost become an expert in something before I turn around and tell it. Because my job is to understand all the jargon y'all are gonna spout and then kind of turn around and translate it for the audience. I think not everybody has time or interest or like sort of the desire to do that in our space. But if you have an issue that you're really like going deep on, you'll often figure out, okay, these are the journalists that do understand it or who have been good on this issue or who are interested in taking that kind of time. And this gets me to something sort of just, again, on like practice that I think is really important, which is Laurel was talking about how annoying it is when somebody just like sends you one written quote. I personally will never, ever submit my questions to somebody ahead of time. And I prefer, unless you're like stuck on the tundra somewhere, where you can't get, like, I don't want a written interview. Like, I want to have a conversation. And that's of benefit to both of us. It's not so I can like getcha. It's because you might say something that you didn't even think was that important. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's the thing. Or it just like leads to much better understanding on my part, quotes on your part. And so I don't know about you guys, but I bristle very much when anybody asks me like for a list of questions ahead of time. I'm happy to give you topics, and so I don't want you to be unprepared. But if you come in knowing what I'm going to ask you, you probably are trying to script it out, and it's just not going to sound very natural.
Yeah, to that point, if you don't mind, so when I've been in so many roles where we have colleagues who are comms directors, press secretaries, they send a press release out, and they think the job is done there. Can you talk to us a little bit about like how many press releases do you get on any given day, and what do you do with press releases? Because I think it's an interesting question. Right? There's one thing is writing a press release, framing a topic, doing it in the way that you've done it well. But coverage is a completely different part of the game, and that's the part that matters, I think.
Yeah. I was at inbox 0 on Friday. I'm at like 662 right now. So that's
662.
And that's probably largely newsletters and press releases, because like individual emails like you guys telling me how to get here, I did open. But like, yeah,
Glad we made the cut.
It's an insane amount.
Press releases are a necessity, and really like hone writing a good press release because they're important. But I would say that the vast majority of times, if I choose to write on something, it's not because of a press release. It's oftentimes because I get an email or a phone call or a text message from somebody that's working on something that says, hey, I just sent you a press release. I think you will find this interesting. Do you want to talk more about it? Even if it's just that little extra nudge, because we do get a million press releases. Most of them are not germane to our jobs at all. We all have the stories of the people that are sending out PR blasts that still have the like, dear, like insert your name here, and then they'll say like, we think that your coverage of video games really reflects the whole. It's like
I've never covered video games
right,
in my life.
Exactly. So I think that the press releases are necessary in order to try and reach the widest audience possible. You never know who's going to open that up and be like, oh, that's actually really interesting to me. But I think if you are working with certain beat reporters, I think that the nudge, the advance, everybody loves a scoop. So if it's possible to give exclusive for things, or
just
heads
to
up,
plan our lives.
I think that is a way. And I think, look, everybody has various different politics to account for, right? If you're working on a bill and there's probably a legislator that's the author of the bill, there's probably 3 or 4 interest groups that are sponsoring the bill and that are working on it, and you want to give everybody their opportunity to have their written quote. And absolutely, because you don't know sort of, perhaps there is a specific advocacy group that a certain, outlet is like, yes, this is actually like, we have relationships, or they're based in our coverage area, and so we want to hear from them. We're not going to include 6 quotes that are all saying the same great thing about a bill. Like, that's not an interesting story to read. So, I think you write your press releases understanding that in some ways it's casting a lot of lines, and then maybe one element of that will get bid on by a certain journalist and be the thing that reels them in. So
also, like, include relevant facts. Like, what I use press releases a lot for is something that I'm already writing on, but like, oh, here's the data points, or here's the like background
links,
information that helps, tell the story.
And also, a snappy subject line goes a long way. I cannot tell you how many emails I get with subject lines I can barely understand because they have so many acronyms in them, and they're like acronyms I've never heard of. And if it's an acronym I've never heard of, I'm probably not going to open the email. I mean, I'm just probably not. So a snappy headline that is attention grabbing and says the thing rather than like tries to give everyone credit from every single alphabet soup agency that's involved in the thing is going to be like much more likely to be read.
in terms of, the original question about breaking down complex policy issues, when you're working on policy, you're in a bubble of people who are also really well steeped in this policy, and so you're going to use jargon. You're going to use sort of the stuff that everybody who's already been sort of really, really well versed in the subject will understand. We're going to have to find a way to decode that jargon to put it into our coverage, and we probably don't understand the jargon ourselves if we're new to the issue area. So I think that as you're thinking about pitching the story, how would you explain it to your mom, your friend at the bar, you're yelling it down the street to your neighbor to be like, hey, read this. You're not going to use acronyms and you're not going to use jargon. So I think really pushing yourself prior to talking to the journalist about how you're going to use the most sort of clean, concise, relatable language possible then makes the entire process much smoother. And in terms of finding real people, e-advocacy groups, the folks that are really on the ground, a lot of times they're, the closer we can get to people who are actually providing services that are, intake for, whatever sort of population that is going to be impacted by this policy. I constantly am calling them and saying, well, have you met somebody who you think is really indicative? And oftentimes it's then 2 or 3 phone calls later, right? Oh, well, we know this guy, and then actually it's his cousin, and then but that is how we end up writing these stories that are very policy heavy, but have real people. It's because
we call them real people.
We do call them real
As
people.
opposed to Jesse, who's like not a real person.
Jesse does not count as a real
I'm
person.
fake, yeah.
Policy wonks, I hate to tell you, but you are also not real people. We're talking about people who are living.
You can be sometimes real people, but yeah.
It's a goal. I hope for all of you that you attain real people status, but the partner groups that you're working with and coming with policy, as you're again trying to think about a media strategy, ask them like, have you met somebody that you think really embodies this problem that we're trying to solve? And even then, being able to say to a journalist early on, like, we actually have this really compelling person who we think would be great for you to talk to. It just helps accelerate the process that we were going to be doing ourselves anyway.
Yeah, and on the practitioner side, I'm sure a lot of us have been there. Depending on what I would be pitching, but I might even include a quick bio. Like, here's 3 people who are willing to talk to you, which means we've probably briefed them on the bill, but they're going to give their own personal testimony so that when you send them the one pitch email, it's like the story, the news, the data, the quote if they want to use it, and then here's 3 people they could actually talk to. So that's also helpful, I think, in the relationship. I think we have time for one more question, maybe.
We may have touched on this a little bit, but if you could just speak to how you approach your jobs in the idea of with disinformation. So where before there would be different sides to one story and you would be maybe being fed different sources, now you're actually coming up against people that aren't telling you the truth on purpose, and how that has shifted your job. And then also as consumers of news, how can we recognize that, and how can we help you in your efforts to sort of eliminate that from the news process and news coverage?
So one technique is what's called the truth sandwich. So it's write the truth, write the misinformation, and then repeat the truth. And so that way you can kind of like buttress it on both sides. So that is one technique that we use when writing about a lot of the things that President Trump says and a lot of the misinformation related to the election. I mean, in 2020. So there was no evidence of widespread fraud. Trump says, fill in the blank. Repeat the fact that there was no evidence of widespread fraud that would change the outcome of the election. I mean, so that's one technique. But the larger question is a very hard to solve one, because the larger question the larger issue that question gets at is the fact that we don't have common sources of information in our society anymore. We have such a fractured media landscape, and so everyone lives in their own echo chamber, and so it's very, very hard. We've seen the ramifications in our society of just like that people are not living in the same realities anymore. Yeah. So,
I think as like consumers of news, like all those signs on like public transit after 9/11. If you see something, say something. Like, if you have a feeling that something you're consuming is not right, like, check it out. You're probably right. So I would say, like, do trust your instincts. For me, I haven't like come across this in my reporting as much where like somebody's just like outright lying to you. I mean, besides covering Trump, which is its whole own thing. But a lot of it is like sort of misstating facts or making connections that don't actually exist. And I do think that some of this just, like, to me, the hardest part of this is actually the live stuff I do. So if you're on air and you're interviewing somebody, you have this responsibility to push back in real time in a way that's like a lot different if you're like interviewing somebody and then deciding what parts of what they said to put in a story, or you have time later to go back and fact check it. And so for me, like, the biggest way to arm myself against that is just to be really prepared and to have facts. And honestly, like, I think one thing I've learned being on the radio, it's like, you can Google stuff in real time. Like, you can be sitting there interviewing somebody and like look it up, because sometimes you don't want to call somebody on somebody and then misstate it, or like give them an opening to push back. But I see this a lot in the criminal justice area where like it's not that somebody is like speaking in bad faith, but like, for example, Nathan Hochman's running for DA in LA right now, former federal prosecutor, ran for attorney general. We were on the air and he was railing against Prop 47. And then he made this pivot, which is about like drug crimes and property crimes, nonviolent stuff, right? And he made this pivot to talking about violent felons that are getting released from prisons. And like, I know enough about that to be like, okay, now you're just conflating two different things, like that's Prop 57. But if I didn't have that knowledge base, I couldn't do that. So to me, like that's the biggest kind of problem right now is how do we, and how do you-
badass journalist, that's the answer right there.
But also to do it in a way that's not like, you're a liar, but like.
Also, you're a liar.
Yeah, also. But like, and in that case, I think what I said was like, come on, you know better. That's not actually, but you can do that in a way, I think, that works. I went to an event at Harvard this year where there was a lot of political journalists kind of talking about this exact thing and how do we cover Trump and how do we call out misinformation without losing our credibility in communities that already distrust mainstream news. And I'm here to tell you we didn't solve that in one day. But I do think kind of getting at what like Marty Barron, the former Washington Post editor, talks about a lot, like, not just covering the horse race, covering the stakes. I think like the context, the policy, like those are the areas where we actually can push back the most because it's not just one person sort of like railing. It is, oh, look, all these things that we can, put forward to kind of level the playing field.
I just want to add one more kind of practical thing for if you are dealing with journalists, particularly if you're in a role of like maybe not an elected official, but working for an elected official. Don't lie to journalists. I mean, none of us expect you to be telling us all of your dirty secrets all the time, but there's a difference between that and being deliberately deceitful. If we find that out, then you've blown your credibility as a source. And Marisa talked earlier about how our reputations as journalists, that we want to be somebody that's known as, that we protect our sources, that we're respectful, we're not going to go out and burn people. I think that your credibility as a source is also really important. And I think that there is a fine line. There's certainly lies by omission, and that happens, that's part of the game. But straight up, if I'm able to catch you in a you are lying to me, it is going to sort of permanently affect the relationship that we have. I might use you as a source again, but I will look askance at a lot of things that you say, and there will have to be sort of an extra layer of verification that maybe otherwise wasn't there before because you have established yourself as somebody that's not a trustworthy source. So, there's always, on the different sides, there's going to be a little bit of gamesmanship. Our job is a lot of times to find out information that perhaps people in power don't want us to know, but there is also ways where the best people on the other side of the job, for me, are able to find ways where they are protecting the interests of their boss, or they're protecting the interest of what have you, without outright lying. Figure out that balance, because I think once you cross that barrier with a lot of journalists, it's really, really hard to regain that credibility. Just as if we did something that was deceitful to you as sources, you wouldn't trust us again. So I think it's a pretty simple, but a plea. Don't lie to journalists, because we have long memories and can sometimes hold grudges.
Very good point. And I think I've worked with all of you for 10 plus years, and we don't always agree, and we all had different bosses, but I think there was like a level of respect where you approach the relationship, where they understand where you're coming from as a practitioner and vice versa. And even saying like, I can't share anymore right now,
Or like,
goes a long way.
Or just like waiting till the deadline passed to call you back, like better than lying.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay, so I think we are at time. I think the last question I would have for the panelists is, if you had one piece of advice to leave with, these aspiring journalists and or practitioners, what would it be?
Support trustworthy media. Pick something that you find valuable and put your money where you find your value, whatever that may be.
I think just on the practical of like, build if you're going into the policy area, like build a relationship with a couple of reporters, because those relationships are helpful even if that's not the right person. I can't tell you how often I, sort of turn a source to another reporter in my newsroom or to somebody else who can help them. And so just like having that ability to trust each other is really foundational.
Yeah, I mean, to just kind of piggyback onto Marisa's point, and it's a self-interested one, but talk to journalists. Because if you were working on something that you're passionate about, you want that news to get out to the world, building those relationships. It's also a way that, quite frankly, a lot of times when you're really working hard on something, you might be sort of in, talking to other people who are similarly aligned. This is a way to sort of stress test. It's a little bit of a gut check. From somebody who isn't sort of working on the same project with you for 6 months or whatever. Oh, are there questions being raised that perhaps didn't occur to you? Are there things that are a little bit tonally off to people who aren't as steeped as this? So a lot of times you become better at your job as a practitioner in public policy by talking to a journalist. And it also is, if you get frustrated by what you see as kind of inadequate or disappointing press coverage in something you're passionate about, it's like be the change you want to see. Like, get to know journalists and help sort of encourage better coverage, because all we want to do is write kick-ass stories that are accurate and thought-provoking and are going to teach people new things. And for those of you who are working in public policy, a lot of the times you are best positioned to help us find those stories.
All right, well, let's thank our panelists again for making the trip out here. And I think we're good. So thank you all for coming out. Appreciate it. Thank you, Meredith, and your class as well. Appreciate you all. Thank you all.